Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we are truly honoured to have such a respected and highly influential economist here to talk to us today. So please welcome Martin Wolf.
Thank you very much for that extremely kind and indeed flattering introduction. It is the case that a number of my friends have described me as influential, and I think that's, that indicates the desperation that they have fallen into, because I can't actually think of anything that I have fought for in the last 10 to 15 years on which I was successful. I feel my influence can only be described as seriously overrated. In the last year, I argued vigorously against Brexit, and even more vigorously, though with even greater sense of futility, against the election of President Trump, and I did it pretty badly on both. Back in 2010, I argued very strongly for the maintenance of strong fiscal support for growth, and instead we had global austerity. Back in my book on globalization, I argued strongly that it was necessary to combine globalization with a strong welfare state, and I failed on that too. So it's a pretty depressing picture. I would remain of the view that I was right in what I argued for, but I cannot say that I've been very influential. I hope you and your generation will do better, because if not, the world is going to be a pretty spectacular mess. I'm going to talk about a subject which is really not something a respectable economist should talk about, because it's basically politics. But then I'm not a respectable economist. I've never held an academic position that was at least as much my choice as that of academic institutions. And I have now for nearly 30 years been a journalist, which is as far from academic respectability as one can get, even though among newspapers, probably the Financial Times is the least unrespectable. So I felt that I could dare to do some amateur analysis of politics, and I felt I justified in doing so by the fact that it clearly relates to economics as well. What I'm going to talk about is the early stage of a book that I'm planning to write, which is on the crisis of democratic capitalism. Or more precisely, the title of this speech will be Elites versus the People, the Rise of Populism and the Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. When I put forward this proposal, which has been accepted, so I now have to write it, I have to say that I thought we had a little bit more time than turned out to be the case. So I thought we were looking at the breakdown in the 2020s, not now. So the book might be a little bit too late. But nonetheless, the issues are very profound. To anchor the discussion, I want to start with a quotation which is one of the better comments, I think, by an economist on political issues that are relevant to my talk. And it's by Danny Roderick, who is, of course, at Harvard. Many of you must have come across his writings. And he had a very famous sentence, which is that democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can combine any two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously and in full. The point being pretty clear that if you want national sovereignty and you want the people to be able to express choices over a very wide range of domains, then full global economic integration imposes significant constraints on national sovereignty and democratic choice, and stresses will emerge. And I think this is a useful way of thinking about at least some of the events of the last year, in which clearly people in Britain have rejected one aspect of global economic integration at least, namely free movement of labor from the EU, and the US, with the election of Donald Trump, seems to have rejected both that and free trade. So Danny's observation seems to me very, very relevant. And that's the quote, just for your information. that is relevant. So what I'm going to do is start off by asking the question why we might ever think that democracy and capitalism might go together. What is the relationship between this form of politics and this form of economic organization, which we in the West, and I've noticed that there are lots of people in this audience who don't come from the West, but we in the West have become used to as a natural combination, or more or less natural combination. Then I'm going to talk about the stresses we're seeing on this synthesis, and then finally I'm going to talk about what might happen. So let me just get rid of this and come to this one, which I think is going to be more relevant. I should say that my notes, which are quite full, and I'm not going to give them all, put all of these up on the board at all, will be available, be posted, and you will be able to see them. So let me start then with democracy and global capitalism. Our world, that is to say the Western world, has until recently been characterized by the march towards globalization and the march towards democracy. In fact, it's not just true of the Western world. Until relatively recently, it was true of much of the world. There are lots of measures showing the rise of the democratic form of government, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire in the late 80s and early 90s. At the same time, globalization, which is global market capitalism, has been our form of economic organization, strongly promoted by governments around the world, including, interestingly, governments which have not accepted democracy, of which the most important by far is China. And of course, the Chinese president has recently been in Davos, I was there at the time, expressing his passionate support for globalization, but of course, as is quite clear, his rejection of democracy. But in the West, democracy is the contemporary form of politics, and it vests control rights over political decisions in national electorates. So we have national electorates making political decisions embedded in a global economic system, a global market economic system. And Roderick's argument is, of course, that deep integration, free trade, free movement of capital and labor, substantial measures of regulatory harmonization, which we have found to be a necessary concomitant of extremely deep integration, and the EU is the best example of this. I discussed that in my book on globalization, which was published now about 13 years ago. These things don't so much hollow out democracy as limit it. They limit the frame, the range over which democratic decisions can be made. And that's been particularly striking in the Eurozone, a point that I've made often, that by going even further and sharing a common currency, a very profound commitment to one another, the policy range of possible policy choice by the Eurozone member countries, above all deficit countries, turned out to be extremely small during the crisis. In all advanced economies, the characteristic being, of course, of an advanced economy that they are much richer on average than the world average. The difference is very large. On average, advanced countries have GDP per head of about 4 times or more the world average. Electorates, the people, enjoy what I call a citizenship rent. That is, say, by virtue of being citizens of these countries, they are much better off than people like them would be anywhere else. Indeed, I would argue that for the great majority of our populations, not all by any means in the West, their citizenship is probably the single most important, not even probably, certainly the single most important asset they own, and they want to guard it. And I think that's part of what has been happening in recent years. Globalization has, particularly if it involves completely free trade and free movement of people, which I might regard as a relatively extreme form, tends to erode citizenship rent. And people notice this and they become angry with the elites that promote it. And they get even angrier when they conclude that the elites are indifferent, incompetent, and possibly even corrupt. And I think that is a fairly good description of what has happened in many developed Western countries, notably in Europe and in the United States, over the last 20 years ago or so. And the result, which we can see everywhere in the West, is populist anger. And the question is, can this be managed? That seems to me the core question that we have to think about. Will we survive this? Will our systems of politics and economics actually survive this development? If we think a bit more about democracy and global capitalism, as I've indicated, at least in the West, it's not true to the same degree elsewhere, where the symbiosis, to the extent it exists, is more recent, we tend to have now to take for granted the symbiosis between democracy and capitalism, or the market economy. It should be noted, by the way, that in the 19th century, the era of the Industrial Revolution, the era of the first emergence of a global, something like a global market economy, the idea that democracy was a natural bedfellow of capitalism would have seemed completely absurd to almost everybody. And of course it wasn't. This symbiosis is a symbiosis of the 20th century. There are arguments for believing that it is quite natural. Some very interesting philosophers have argued that. Historically, one could argue that the rise of capitalism was at least associated with, and some could argue was a causal factor in, the elimination of serfdom and slavery, and by ultimately successful movements, again, particularly in the West, and in many countries more recently, for wide extension of the franchise. So by the early third to half of the 20th century, most Western societies had become universal suffrage democracies. And behind this, I think, were the combination of widely shared prosperity, or increasingly widely shared prosperity, I don't wish to exaggerate that, the spread of education, an essential concomitant of an advancing market economy, as was discovered. It became very clear to people in charge of Western societies by the middle to late 19th century, even more in the 20th century, they needed an educated labor force. Other factors was the emergence of organized labor as a powerful political and economic and social force. And of course, we shouldn't forget the mobilization of the adult population, both male and female, in total war. And I would add that, it's a point I've made quite often, that rising prosperity, the general assumption that economies will get richer over time, if not achieved in every given year, achieved over any appreciable number of years in the Western world, created the opportunity for what I call positive sum politics. What do I mean positive sum politics? I mean the possibility in a society in which people are getting richer to provide, to do politics in the form of A gets more without B getting less. It becomes increasingly, though this is too simple, about sharing out the fruit of growth, not just taking from A to give to B. Zero-sum and negative-sum politics, which is very much where we are now in the Western world, very much in this country, becomes pretty bitter pretty quickly. Ideologically, or if you like philosophically, I would also say the underlying idea of capitalism, of the market economy, that the people who are engaging in truck, barter, and exchange, Adam Smith's phrase, under the protection of the law, implies that the choices of individuals have an inherent value. A market economy rests on the assumption that people should be entitled to make economic decisions for themselves. And the underlying idea of democratic citizenship, that of individuals engaged in collective decision-making process, also rests on the assumption that individual choices have value, though this time through some form of weighing machine, a voting process that allows them to make public choices. So to some extent, I think we can see why these two forms this form of politics and this form of economics should go together. But there are also both ideological and historical conflicts between democracy and capitalism, and I think they're very relevant today. So first, democracy, of course, rests on a profoundly egalitarian ideal, at least among the citizen body, and I'm talking about universal suffrage democracy, rests on an idea of one person, one vote. Capitalism, of course, inherently rests on an egalitarian ideal, that is to say, it's £1, one vote. In Albert Hirschman's phraseology, democracy, and I would strongly recommend the work of Albert Hirschman on exit, voice, and loyalty in thinking about these profoundly important questions. Democracy is the domain of what he called voice. It's where we get together to talk and argue among ourselves about how political choices should be made, while capitalism is the domain of exit. In other words, if you don't like what's going on in your country, you go somewhere else. If you don't like what's being offered in this market, you go to some other supplier. A third problem is that it is clearly possible, and we've seen it happen many times, for enormous inequalities to emerge in the market economic system, and that can, and this has happened in the past, and can easily happen again. Indeed, I would argue it is happening again, particularly in the US. Enormous inequalities risk turning democracy into veil of a plutocracy. That is to say, those with money and therefore those who are able to influence the political process have enormously much more vote, as it were, weight in the political process than the vast mass of people. And finally, if democracy and the market economy are seen to fail in their primary function of delivering prosperity and security, we risk the emergence of illiberal forms of democracy. And again, that is very much what we are seeing in many countries right now. So those seem to me to be the issues we have to think about from first principles, and if we want to think at least at all about whether this marriage, which to some extent is natural and in some respect is clearly unnatural, will survive. Will we still have democratic capitalism 3 or 4 decades from now, other than possibly in Switzerland, which I consider to be the last bastion, the one country that will survive longest in this form of government? And so now I would like to consider why I think right now this symbiosis has become so stressed. And I'm going to consider very quickly 8 forms of stress. They come together, but I won't have the time in this presentation, which obviously is very summary, to go through the interrelations in any depth. Maybe we can do so in questions. So the first point is the globalization of capitalism. 40 or 50 years ago, 60 years ago, it depends what period you want to choose, capitalism was still largely national. Barriers to trade, barriers to movement of capital, barriers to movement of people after the Second World War in the Western world were still very high. Liberalization was beginning, but essentially there were a few exceptions. There were no multinational companies. There were a few exceptions, Unilever, the oil companies, Ford, but not many. Companies were very clear where they belonged to. They were generally owned by citizens of or the states in the countries where they operated, and people clearly saw an identification of interest between themselves as workers and as citizens and the national companies, whether publicly owned or private. This has clearly changed dramatically. Now we have global companies, we have global fiscal arbitrage, global labor arbitrage, a very different sort of system that has gone with globalization. In the context, of course, of wildly divergent costs of labor and so forth across the world. Another consequence of that, or a consequence of that, is the increasing effectiveness of exit by owners of capital and skilled labor. If owners of capital and skilled labor in particular don't find where they are particularly attractive, it's now far easier for them to go elsewhere, to exit from the country in which they happen to be located. That puts pressure on the state's revenue, and so its ability to respond to economic pressure. Governments, I think they tend to exaggerate, but governments constantly argue they can't raise taxes on skilled workers, highly paid workers, or business, because if they chose to do so, the capital or labor would leave. That's a very important thing to have happened in limiting political choice. Yet another element in the story, as I've already indicated, is the rise of supranational business entities that are no longer seen to belong to a country and do not themselves feel they belong to a country. So the question arises, to whom are they loyal? And it's that very question that Mr. Trump is asking pretty well every day. It's a core part of his rhetoric against American capitalism. And in the process, as I've indicated, national capitalism has morphed into global capitalism. So that's the first set of challenges, the move from national to global capitalism, with all that implies for the domain of political choice. The second issue is rising inequality, the separation of different groups in society. Now, I don't have the time to go into the literature on this, which is colossally deep and complicated, but I think the broad thing you can say is there have been very large rises in inequality over the last 35 years or so in a number of important developed countries, but not quite all. The biggest by far in the US, a very large rise in inequality in this country in the 80s, which has since stabilized, but is now expected to get worse again in the next several years. I wrote about that in my column on Friday. Almost nowhere in the developed world has inequality fallen in the last 30 years, but the degree to which it has risen has varied depending on policy choices, a very important point. Interestingly, almost never noted, the one significant Western country in which inequality seems to have fallen in the last 35 years is France. Inequality, one could argue, is bad in itself for fairly well-known utilitarian reasons, but I'm going to put this to one side. But it seems to me pretty clear that it has political implications since, and this is after all hardly a new idea since it's part of the whole political history of humanity since we started creating political structures some 10,000 years ago, the possession of economic resources can be and frequently has been converted into political power. I suggest, if you want a nice example which isn't contemporary, you think of the history of the Medici in Republican Florence, a perfect example in which wealth created by banking was converted into dynastic power. Recent books on the activities of the Koch brothers in the US raise, I think, similar question. The third issue, very different, but very important, I think, is immigration and the response to it. It's quite interesting, and I don't think in the least surprising, that there have been two ages of globalization since the Industrial Revolution. The first was the late 19th and early 20th century. It came to a brutal halt with the First World War, and with the First World War, the interwar years, and the Second World War, globalization was fully and completely reversed before it restarted. That late 19th and early 20th century period was a period of mass migration on an absolutely enormous scale, far bigger relative to the world's population than the more recent one. But it is, in my view, not at all accidental that the more recent age of globalization, the last 30 years or so, has also been associated with, I don't wish to emphasize the causal relationship too crudely, an upsurge, or at least a moderate upsurge in migration. And of course, immigration, particularly immigration from poorer countries to rich countries, from the point of view of the citizens of rich country with their citizenship rent, reinforces the effects of the globalization of trade and of capital. But it adds what is clearly turning out to be quite a stressful and uncomfortable cultural dimension to these forces, and we're beginning to get profoundly disturbing cultural backlashes. anyone who is unaware of how significant this has become, I strongly recommend you start reading some of the recent articles that have appeared at length on the ideology of Stephen Bannon, who is, of course, one of Trump's most influential advisors, and who basically feels that the West is engaged in a cultural war which has clearly echoes of the ideology of the 1930s. Moreover, in the context of the democratic state, immigration inevitably raised questions about who we, the citizens, are. Who are the people for whom this state is supposed to work? Citizens tend to want to decide who can live with them or become citizens themselves. We saw exactly the same phenomenon in the 20s when the US started closing itself up to immigration after having been completely open to immigration, and we see this now with the Brexit vote in Britain. So immigration is the third challenge. The fourth challenge is crises. The age of market liberalization has been an age of pretty big financial crises. Indeed, there is an excellent book which I strongly recommend too, which I used in my most recent book, which was on the financial crisis, by a man called Gary Gorton, who's a professor at Yale, who's basically described the last 35 years as the period of the reemergence of financial crises after the quiet period, what he calls the quiet period from the 30s onwards. And of course, Raghuram Rajan's very significant work, co-authored with Carmen Reinhardt, on financial crises, This Time is Different, says exactly the same thing. The last financial crisis, which began in 2007, imposed immense economic costs, at least unexpected economic costs, elevated unemployment, at least temporarily in some countries, permanently in others, particularly in Southern Europe, and a permanent decline in levels and rates of growth of GDP, and a huge rise in public debt. And the crisis has also imposed large political costs, conflicts over how losses should be allocated, and above all, as I've indicated, loss of confidence in elites, businesses, politicians, and economists. I've got a couple of charts just to keep you awake, just to indicate, I think this is rather an interesting picture of what happened to the advanced economies after the financial crisis of 2007. This is very simple. It's taken from IMF data. So the red line shows the actual aggregate GDP at purchasing power parity, but when you're comparing the developed countries, that adjustment doesn't make much difference. It makes much more difference when you're comparing developed with developing, with less wealthy economies. So the red line shows what's happened to actual GDP. You can see the marked recession in the developed countries in 2008-9, the first true recession actually since the 30s in the developed world. The green line is simply a continuation of the pre-crisis trend. It's what GDP would have been if it continued, which was more or less what the experts all expected. And the blue line, which you read on the right-hand scale, is the ratio of the actual to the expected, as I've defined it in a very simple way. And what it shows is that if we don't have a big recovery, and at the moment the red line indicates the GDP growth of the developed world is extremely stable at a much lower rate than before, almost half actually, a little bit more but not much over, then by 2020 GDP in the developed world will be 1/5 smaller than it would have been if the trend had continued. Today, it's roughly 1/6 smaller. This is an enormous shock. The only comparable shock that I've been able to discover was the Great Depression of the 30s. It is, if you want to be cheerful, worth noting, because I looked at this quite carefully, that US GDP got back to the pre-Great Recession trend line finally by the early 1960s. It took 30 years. So it is conceivable that we are at the beginning now of we'll have a terrific turnaround and we'll get back to where we were. That's unlikely because demography, this is GDP, not GDP per head, so that probably won't apply, and I could have done in GDP per head. It doesn't look so different. But nonetheless, right at the moment, more or less 10 years after the crisis, we are showing enormous losses. And the second chart, I don't want to overstress the value of this. There are some problems with the measurement, but this comes from a study by McKinsey, which I quite enjoy, which I think stimulates thought. What it shows is, for a number of significant developed countries, what proportion of households have suffered either flat or falling real incomes from both wages and capital, starting in 2005 and ending in 2014. So the answer to that is, in Italy, 97% of households, in the US, 81%, in the UK, 70%, Netherlands, 70%, France, 63%, and Sweden is an exception with only 20%. And the weighted average of 25 developed countries is 65%, or 2/3. So an enormous proportion of our populations have now experienced 10 years of completely flat or declining real incomes. And that hasn't happened again since the 1930s. The fifth stress, which I've already touched on very briefly when referring to demography, is aging. Of course, and it's not at all surprising, it's absolutely predictable. Once we moved to universal suffrage representative democracy, we also moved towards welfare states. It was absolutely inevitable that in a society with universal suffrage, people who had no capital of their own, and it is worth stressing, Piketty brings this out very clearly, the vast bulk of our populations have almost no capital of their own, will try to gain wealth and security from state activity, and I think that's completely legitimate and proper. It's what you would have expected, and I think it was right. But as a result of that, the ratio of public spending and transfers to gross domestic product exploded in the 20th century in all Western democracies to the low 30% of GDP and a high of 60% of GDP, from universally less than 10% before World War I. And you think about it, that can't happen again. So for much of the second half of the 20th century, to some extent even in the first half after the First World War, but mainly the second half, public spending grew much faster than GDP in the developed world, which was itself growing very fast. In future, we can expect public spending, transfers, and government consumption to grow no faster than GDP, and possibly less fast, and GDP is growing slowly. So fiscal pressures become permanent. The sixth stress is the transformation of the media. In the media, I think old problems are reinforced by new ones. The old problem is concentrated ownership and the power of a dominant plutocracy. The new problem is technology, which is making the dissemination of information costless. Or as I like to say it, the result is the costless dissemination of non-information, alternative facts or lies with incredible speed. Generating truth is rather expensive and costly. Working in a relatively reliable, or I would say as reliable as we can possibly make it, news media, I assure you it's really expensive to do what we do. It's much cheaper to make it up. And if you have a system for disseminating lies as if they were truth, you have a working what I think of as the media equivalent of Gresham's law. Bad information crowds out good information, and with bad information, democracy is fundamentally unworkable. 2.7, authoritarian capitalism. From the Second World War to the end of the Cold War, successful capitalist economies were also democracies. Now, we can't ignore the fact that the rise of China is changing this in a very profound way and in a very influential way. China, it is increasingly clear, is not going to be democratic or not anyone's true anytime soon, but it is trying to be capitalist. And to some extent, its success and money is providing a pole of attraction for others. And also important now is the rise of what I've already referred to as illiberal democracy, I think a term invented by my friend Fareed Zakaria, a journalist in the US, in Russia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and now the US. And finally, while we consider all these stresses on national decision-making, we have to remember that we have a highly integrated economy. We are highly dependent upon one another. We are stressing the global environment in very profound ways. So we continue to need at least as much global cooperation as we had before. And in important areas, I think like managing the global commons, we need more of it. So that politics is pulling us away from being globally responsible and thinking about the world globally, and the economics and the nature of our economies. Think about our financial system, our trade system, impact on the commons, security. We require more global cooperation than before. So to conclude, we are in a world of profound transition and transformation, with the current political system of the Western world in particular under enormous stresses and constraints. So how might this end? So this is where you might think about the future. One, that we basically continue in our very uneasy and uncomfortable relationship without any breakdown in the system. The second possibility is there is a collapse of democracy into naked authoritarianism and xenophobia in one or more than one really important state. I think that's pretty plausible now. The third possibility is without that happening within democracy, we can increasingly move towards closing the borders and a return to national capitalism. The fourth possibility is a collapse of democracy and closure at the borders. The fifth policy is that democracies regenerate themselves, deepen cooperation among themselves on things like taxation, regulation, environmental challenges, and we emerge with a new and fruitful democratic synthesis, both national and global. And if that really works, we return to or cement the cooperative world, which in my view we need. But make no doubt about it, in my view at least, we are at a really profound historical turning point, and decisions made over the next 5-10 years could shape the nature of human life, political and economic, across the globe, and certainly in the West, for much of the rest of this century. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. We will now be taking 2 questions before the break. The lady in the front here, to the right.
Hello, my name is Fern Davidson-Averill from the University of Leeds. To what extent do you think that the current direction that globalization is heading in will threaten the state-led capitalist system of China, or do you think that it will strengthen it further?
How long have I got to answer these questions?
Only 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. That's an enormous question. So my first answer to that is I don't know, and I don't think anyone does. It is clear that the Chinese government is committed not only to maintaining but strengthening the current political system in important ways, and in important ways making it, from my point of view, less liberal. Wasn't democratic anyway, but less liberal. While opening the economy to the world and increasing the role of market forces within China. I think there are 2 points to be made about that, because I could go into lots of detail. First of all, they've done this incredibly successfully since 1978. So that's now a very long time. Right? So, and during that time, China economy grew dramatically, nearly 40 years. And the political system survived. It survived the shock of the collapse of the Soviet system. It survived Tiananmen. So my first starting point is I wouldn't bet against them. There's a record here. But the second point is I think, and Westerners were more optimistic. Many Westerners thought that when China joined the WTO, was moved more rapidly into the market system, the pressures for political change will be greater than they have turned out to be. So, as I said, don't bet against them. On the other hand, over time, if the Chinese economy is to succeed, it's going to have to become a true frontier society, profoundly innovative. It is almost inevitably going to become more globally open in crucial respects, vis-a-vis capital, both foreign direct investment and I think actual capital flows, though that might take a very long time. And of course, to be such an economy, I think you will need both a pretty solid rule of law and pretty fair openness on information. So managing this over the next 30 years, if China proceeds to become a developed country, will, in my view, become very, very difficult. I don't expect to be alive 30 years from now. Anything's possible, it's unlikely. But if I were betting, I would say that over the next 30 years, if they're successful economically, that the pressure to transform the system will probably become quite substantial. But predicting the political evolution of China has been a mug's game for a very long time, and I certainly don't want to advance any sort of simplistic thesis that democracy in some form is inevitable. There is one other point I would like to make, which I think is important in this context, though most people ignore it, which is what happens to India. India will actually be the biggest country in the world within 10 years. It is, God knows, a pretty messy but vibrant democracy. Its economy is growing reasonably well, not as fast as China's, and it's much poorer. If India were, and I'm stressing the if, to do very well over the next 30 years in its development, within the context of politics, of its messy politics, both of which are clearly conditional statements, that could change the feeling about democracy, possibly even in China. And there was another question?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions. Dear. I'm terribly sorry.
I knew that question was going to kill it. I'm very, very sorry that I went on, and I'm very sorry we don't have more time for questions and answers.
We're sorry for all those that do have questions. Again, our team will be conducting an interview with Mr. Wolf, and that will be available online should you want more information. But for now, please join me in giving Martin Wolf a warm round of applause.